A young woman vanished from her own home in the quiet hours before dawn, leaving behind nothing that made sense. There were no signs of a struggle, no forced entry, no note explaining where she had gone. What began as a missing person case quickly transformed into a chilling homicide investigation that would shock an entire community and eventually ripple far beyond it. Eve Carson was born on November 19, 1985, in Athens, Georgia. From a very early age, it was clear she was different. Highly disciplined, intensely motivated, and deeply compassionate, Eve seemed driven by a sense of purpose that set her apart from her peers. In high school, she served as vice president of the student council while simultaneously volunteering at a nursing home and a shelter for abused teenagers. She worked as a congressional page, assisted in a stem cell research lab, and still managed to graduate with top honors. Her academic success earned her admission to the University of North Carolina, where she pursued a demanding double major in political science and biology. She was awarded a prestigious scholarship and quickly became one of the most recognizable student leaders on campus. Eve held leadership roles in multiple organizations, mentored younger students, and continued her commitment to service by teaching science to elementary school children. Her ambition didn't stop at the classroom. Eve traveled abroad for humanitarian and academic work, spending a summer assisting doctors in Ecuador, studying in Cuba for a semester, and later joining a research team in Egypt. Professors described her as exceptional. Friends described her as tireless. By every measure, she was on a fast track toward a remarkable future. By February, Eve was 22 years old and in her final year of college. She lived off campus with a small group of close friends and was preparing for life after graduation. She had already secured a job offer with a major company and was only months away from beginning her career. On the night of March 5th, shortly after 1:30 a.m., her roommates were getting ready to leave for a party. They invited Eve to come along, but she declined. She had coursework to finish and decided to stay home and study. Her friends left, assuming she would still be there when they returned later that night. When they came back around 4:30 a.m., something immediately felt wrong. The front door was standing wide open. The lights inside the house were still on. Eve was gone. So was her car. At first, they tried to rationalize it. Maybe she had stepped out briefly. Maybe an emergency had come up. They called her phone repeatedly, but there was no answer. As the hours passed and morning arrived with no sign of Eve, fear replaced hope. By the next day, one of her roommates made the call no one ever wants to make. She contacted the police and reported Eve missing. What the investigators told her next would change everything. When Eve's friend arrived at the police station to file the report, officers exchanged a look that immediately raised concern. They explained that earlier that same morning, patrol units had responded to a disturbing call from a nearby neighborhood. A woman living roughly a mile from Eve's home reported being jolted awake by the sound of multiple gunshots, followed by a scream that cut through the silence of the night. When officers reached the scene, they found the body of a young woman lying on the ground. She carried no identification, no phone, no personal belongings of any kind. At the time, all they could determine was that she had been shot several times and left where she fell. Investigators showed Eve's friend a photograph of the victim. She recognized her instantly. The timeline began to take shape quickly. Eve had last been seen alive around 1:30 a.m., alone in her home, studying. By approximately 5 a.m., her body had been discovered just a mile away. Somewhere within that narrow window, something had gone terribly wrong. Detectives returned to the house she shared with her roommates to search for clues. There were no signs of forced entry. Nothing appeared ransacked. But a closer look revealed something important. Eve's wallet and credit cards were missing. Her purse was gone as well. Medical examiners later confirmed there were no indications of sexual assault, narrowing the list of possible motives. Her car was also missing, strengthening the theory that robbery played a central role. Police reviewed Eve's phone records and learned her device last connected to a cell tower near a highway just outside the city. The phone itself was never recovered, leading investigators to believe it had been deliberately discarded, possibly tossed into nearby wooded areas. Another key detail emerged from a forensic analysis of Eve's computer. Records showed it had been active until approximately 3:30 a.m. This meant Eve had remained at home for at least 2 hours after her roommates left. Whatever happened next occurred after that point. As news of Eve's death spread, shock rippled across the university campus. She was widely known, deeply respected, and admired by students and faculty alike. Candlelight vigils appeared overnight. Fear followed close behind. Students began questioning their own safety, especially as days passed with no arrest and no clear suspect. Police were inundated with tips. Students reported unfamiliar cars, strangers on sidewalks, anything that felt even slightly out of place. Yet none of the leads brought investigators closer to identifying who had taken Eve's life. Then, detectives uncovered something that shifted the entire direction of the case. Investigators turned their attention to Eve's financial records, focusing on the missing credit cards. What they found immediately raised alarms. Just 18 minutes after Eve's computer activity stopped, someone attempted to withdraw money from her account. 2 separate transactions were completed, totaling $700, the maximum allowed under her daily limit. Additional attempts were made but declined by the bank. The withdrawal took place at an ATM located near a shopping center on the opposite side of town. Detectives rushed to obtain surveillance footage from the location, hoping for a break. What they saw confirmed their fears. The video clearly showed a man sitting in the driver's seat of Eve's car, using her bank card at the ATM. In the back seat, there appeared to be a second figure. Investigators suspected it could have been Eve, but the footage was too grainy to say for certain. Forensic specialists tried enhancing the images, adjusting contrast and sharpness, but the results remained inconclusive. As detectives dug deeper, they discovered a disturbing pattern. Eve's card had been used repeatedly at different ATMs across the city, suggesting whoever had it was moving around deliberately, attempting to extract as much money as possible. Unfortunately, most of those machines lacked surveillance cameras. 2 days later, on March 7th, police received another alert. Around 12:30 a.m., someone attempted to use Eve's card at a 24-hour convenience store in a neighboring town. The transaction was declined, but this time the location had working security cameras. When investigators reviewed the footage, they were stunned. The person using the card was not the same man seen in the earlier ATM video. This discovery changed everything. It suggested either multiple suspects were involved or that Eve's card had been passed to someone else after the initial withdrawal. Both possibilities pointed to a coordinated crime rather than a random act. With no clear identification from the footage, police made a difficult decision. They released still images from both surveillance videos to the public, asking for help. The case had already captured widespread attention, and now the pressure intensified. Tips flooded in once again. Names were called in. Faces were suggested. Rumors spread rapidly. But despite the volume of information, nothing solid emerged. Days passed with no arrest. Then, on March 12th, everything changed. On March 12th, detectives received a call that immediately stood out from the rest. An anonymous tipster claimed to recognize the man shown in the convenience store surveillance footage. According to the caller, the individual was a local man named Diario Atwater. Investigators wasted no time digging into Atwater's background, and what they uncovered was deeply troubling. At just 21 years old, he already had a lengthy criminal record that included arrests for robbery, assault, drug-related offenses, and other violent crimes. Despite repeated encounters with law enforcement, he had been released early on multiple occasions. Digging further, detectives discovered something even more alarming. Just 2 days after Eve was murdered, Atwater was scheduled to appear in court on charges related to carrying a handgun while on probation. Police pulled Atwater's past booking photos and compared them to the convenience store footage. The resemblance was undeniable. With that confirmation, investigators moved quickly to locate him. Atwater lived only a short distance from the store where the second ATM attempt had been made. When officers brought him in for questioning, Atwater denied any involvement in Eve's murder. But the surveillance footage, combined with his criminal history, was enough to place him under arrest. As the investigation expanded, detectives noticed frequent communication between Atwater and a 17-year-old named Lawrence Levette. Despite his age, Lawrence already had his own criminal record. When police examined his mugshot, they immediately recognized him as the driver seen in the earlier ATM footage, the man using Eve's card while seated in her car. Unlike Atwater, Lawrence did not surrender peacefully. When police attempted to arrest him, he barricaded himself inside his home, forcing authorities to call in a SWAT team. After a tense standoff, officers finally took him into custody. Like Atwater, Lawrence denied any involvement in the crime. With both suspects jailed and refusing to cooperate, investigators focused on strengthening their case through forensic and digital evidence. Cell phone records revealed a critical detail. On the night Eve was taken, both suspects' phones connected to cell towers near her neighborhood, despite the fact that they lived in a different city. This suggested the two had traveled to the area intentionally. Detectives began to suspect that Eve was not targeted personally, but chosen at random, someone alone, late at night, and vulnerable. The evidence pointed toward a robbery that escalated into something far darker. Based on the financial records and movement data, investigators pieced together a grim sequence of events. Eve had likely been forced into her own car sometime after 3:30 a.m. From there, she was driven across multiple locations while her captors attempted to drain her bank account. Each stop brought another failed or limited withdrawal, until the daily limit of $700 was reached. At that point, Eve was no longer of use to them. Prosecutors later argued that the suspects drove her to a secluded area on the outskirts of town, far from witnesses and surveillance. There, she was shot multiple times. The brutality of the attack made it clear that this was not a crime committed in panic, but one carried out with chilling deliberation. Given the severity of the crime, the district attorney announced plans to seek the death penalty against Dario Atwater. Lawrence Levette's situation was different. Because he was a minor at the time of the murder, the harshest sentence he could face was life in prison. Prosecutors knew the case carried risks. While the evidence was strong, securing convictions against both men would be far easier with cooperation. They offered Atwater a deal: plead guilty, testify truthfully, and the death penalty would be taken off the table. Atwater accepted. In his confession, he admitted that he and Lawrence went out that night with the intention of committing a robbery. According to him, Lawrence had suggested targeting someone near the university campus. As they drove through a residential neighborhood, they noticed Eve through a window, alone inside her home. They were armed. They forced their way inside and ordered her into her own car. As they drove from ATM to ATM, Eve begged them to let her go, promising she would never report what had happened. She pleaded to be taken home, but Atwater said they decided she had to die. She had seen their faces. They had made no effort to hide their identities. One detail from his confession stood out above all others. Just before she was killed, Eve asked them to pray with her. They refused. Instead of showing mercy, the two men ended her life where she stood. Eve was shot multiple times with two different weapons, her body left behind as they fled. The confession sent a wave of grief and anger through the community, confirming fears many had tried to push aside since the night she disappeared. In April 2010, nearly 2 years after the murder, Dario Atwater stood before the court. Because of the plea agreement, prosecutors no longer sought the death penalty. The judge sentenced him to life in prison, along with an additional 30 years. After the sentence was read, Atwater turned toward Eve's parents, apologized, and admitted that he deserved to spend the rest of his life behind bars. Lawrence Leavitt chose a different path. He rejected a plea deal and went to trial in December 2011. His defense team attempted to distance him from the killing, but the evidence proved overwhelming. Atwater's testimony, combined with cell phone data, surveillance footage, and financial records, sealed the outcome. Lawrence was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. For a time, it seemed the case had reached its end. But in 2013, the State Court of Appeals overturned Lawrence's sentence, citing a broader legal ruling that questioned the constitutionality of life without parole for juvenile offenders. The decision granted him a new trial and reignited painful memories for Eve's family and friends. At his resentencing, Lawrence spoke openly, insisting that everyone makes mistakes and arguing that he should not be defined by one night. Yet many in the courtroom noted the absence of true remorse. Once again, the judge imposed a life sentence, reaffirming the gravity of the crime. Investigators later revealed that Lawrence had also been a suspect in a strikingly similar case months before Eve's murder. In early 2008, another student had been killed during a home invasion, followed by ATM withdrawals using the victim's card. Despite the similarities, prosecutors were never able to secure enough evidence, and those charges were ultimately dropped.